Edelweiss and CNBC TV 18 present Change India, what India needs.
Hello, welcome to Change India. This week we're discussing, can the Modi government energize Indian infrastructure? Truth be said, infrastructure has been a priority for the last 3 or 4 governments, but we still fall woefully short on all counts. So will the current upturn in sentiment automatically mean that we'll see infrastructure picking up and ensure that we get our roads, we get our ports, we get our power and all of that on stream, or is there still a lot to be done? To discuss the agenda for infrastructure, we have with us in Delhi Mr. Rajeshwar Singh, former chairman of the National Highways Authority of India. With me in Mumbai, we got Mr. M.S. Unnikrishnan, Managing Director and CEO of Thermax, Mr. Sunit Maheshwari, Group Executive Vice President, Corporate Affairs at L&T Holdings Financial, and Mr. M.K. Sinha, Managing Partner and CEO at IDFC Alternatives. But gentlemen, before we come to you, we did speak to a few other people, and let's hear what they had to say.
I think the government has actually gone out of its way to try to look at all aspects of it. Not just what needs to be done on the ground, but also the financing, the regulatory aspects. And I think looking at all of those things, I think they've definitely tried to articulate a broader vision.
One of the major issues in infrastructure is implementation. I think if the government and the PPP sector that we talked about, I don't think the PPP has really succeeded in our country because it's not been thought through. And there have been hurdles like land acquisition has been a problem, the commitment that the government has given has been a problem, single window clearances are not there, environmental clearances have always stuck up the projects. So given all that factors, I think the government should very seriously think of clear-cut roadmap for implementing the policies that they have taken up, and they must go through with speed.
2 things which are, I think, really fantastic. One is the fact that creating a bond market and giving incentives, tax incentives for bonds, that banks can raise bonds, and especially excluding those from RBI norms like SLR ratios. I think that's been a huge issue for banks. So they will end up getting a lot of money. Okay,
so money and implementation. Let me start with you. One of the criticisms, very few criticisms actually, because it's very difficult to really find someone criticize this government because the sentiment and hope is so high, is that that we haven't had a grand reform agenda announced by the government. Now, others argue that that's not needed. What you need is really implementation of existing policy. Broadly, in infrastructure, are all reforms in place? Do we need further reforms there, or do we just need implementation?
In some sectors, reforms may not be a priority, but there are some sectors where it is the priority. For example, in PPP related areas, we need to have a lot more of traction done by the government, and it's not understood. For example, let me take power as a sector. We had the Indian Electricity Act put in the Parliament in 2003, that chapter 1 of the story written, and no second, third, fourth chapter in 11 years of existence. That's why the kind of problems that we are facing today. We mentioned about an open access. Is it really practically on the ground happening? We spoke about price variation in the beginning itself. If there is a force majeure condition or maybe a sovereign action taken by some other country. But what's happened to a couple of projects where there had been sovereign action taken by an outside country, and the Indian companies who invested in that is suffering. So the PPP structure is where the failure has happened, and reforms are necessity. It's a necessity over there. Okay. How am I putting it across that? A PPP means a public-private partnership. It's not privatization. The way it is seen by the governance is like a privatization, whereas it is something like a government and private organizations together giving a public service. That's expectations. I would say in various other sectors like ports, airports, reforms are better than power, but it's still inadequate. Because whenever you're having public service, infrastructure is fundamentally for the public service. We have to elevate the citizen to make him pay equivalent to what is the cost incurred minimum. And if anything more than the cost is paid, then there is a payback for it. Then the banking system comes into funding it. So we are yet to be reaching to that level of, I would say, maturity in the entire infrastructure implementation, where government is stepping aside and telling private industries come forward and do that. That's my understanding.
Okay. So let me just get to Rajeshwar Singh here. Really, when we talk about infrastructure, we talk about linkages. One, we need energy linkages. One, we need physical linkages, roads, ports, etc. Do we need further reform there?
We have to look at 4 basic questions. Are we ready to start the projects? Have we done all the pre-construction work? Have we done the project reports? Have we done the feasibility reports? That's one set of questions, and that covers all the land acquisition, construction, these sort of questions which have been raised. So that is the pre-construction phase. That's one important area where we need reforms. The second and the crucial question is who's going to pay the bills? Because if this is going to be an EPC type of contract done on budget, out of budgetary resources, there isn't much room to maneuver. Budgetary resources are extremely stretched. Government wants to bring down inflation, have a stable macroeconomic climate, prevent the rupee from depreciating, and you cannot just blow up the budget on infrastructure EPC type of projects. If you can't do that, then you have a very limited room for maneuver. You have to go to PPP, and PPP, as Mr. Unikrishnan and Mr. Maheshwari and Mr. Sinha will all tell you, can only be done if the project is commercially viable. And in infrastructure, we always are struggling between doing projects which are commercially viable and can be done on the PPP route, because there's a good return there for any investor who wants to come in, and projects which have to be done even if they're not commercially viable, but they have to be done because they're strategically very important. You do have to reach out to the backward areas of the country. So this is always a question which is determined by, what is the mode of financing, and I think that's a critical question government has to face up to. The third question is, who's going to build it? Because at the moment, many of the EPC type firms are going through an acute crisis of funding. Some of them are solvent because they've done asset sales. Many of them have been going through very painful corporate debt restructuring, and they're finding banks are not willing to fund them beyond a point. So do we have the firms ready to get up and sprint and build these projects? That's the third broad sort of questions. And the fourth question was what was raised in the context of the power sector. What happens after the project is built? Do you get further reforms? Are your tariffs flexible? Are you keeping market realities in view? Are you revising tariffs once there's an external shock? So there's a pre-construction phase. There's a huge financial question. There's a question of who will be the players. And there's a question of what happens once a project is completed. Does it remain viable?
So does it all boil down to viability and who will pay? Because whether it's, if you look at the problems in power, it boils down to that. Yes, there have been problems on management, but it finally boils down to lack of liquidity. So does it all, and you two gentlemen are the best place to answer that since you fund all of these projects.
Yeah, I think Mr. Singh just mentioned that we've had lots of implementation issues in infrastructure projects in India. I think we had a great run in terms of initiating privately sponsored infrastructure projects between 2003 to 2007, and then we hit the implementation wall, land acquisition, environmental clearances, certain policy issues. I think Mr. Singh made the point that we in India do not pay enough attention to front-end engineering and design. I think projects are ill-conceived to begin with. If the projects are conceived well, I think a lot of the issues that we are encountering right now in the infrastructure sector will be taken care of. So, financing is available. I think India is...
But finance will look for viable projects, and you're saying...
I think public-private partnership is all about compromises. You cannot have a perfect solution. As long as one of the parties is not disproportionately compromising, I think one needs to get on with the program and focus on implementation. We keep talking about reforms because we haven't conceived it appropriately at the front end.
Okay.
If it's conceived appropriately at the front end, I think we can just implement it. There is adequate financing available.
Sunil, would you agree? Because so are we making too much of the fact that we need coal linkages, we need all of that? Because those are things that happen eventually anyway to a project. But we really need to deal with projects as they are. And
in India, we are quite obsessed with doing new things. Do a new reform. There was an old reform done. Have we followed it through? Have we carried it through? I'm sure there are some new learnings from the old reform where we need to do course corrections, etc. Just a very simple thing. Why this PPP, the last P, which is participation, which we forget, is important is because an infrastructure project is probably somewhere between 15 to 25 years. It is inconceivable to say the set of conditions that were done at the time when the project was awarded, and that environment will not change, and some relaxation or some discussion or some compromise, as MK said, would have to be done. And
all that be written
our
into-
system has not thought that through, and we have not devised it. Today, and it's not that the people in the government don't realize it, but they're just too scared of the fact that if there is a relaxation done, there is an issue of vigilance, and there are issues of question. And the kind of judicial activism that has happened, while it may be right at one place, I think it hasn't helped. For example, now
you go back 30 years for a case.
Various things you go back. Retroactive taxation, of course, is another issue. So I think, at the point in time, and I think Mr. Singh mentioned, even MK mentioned, if you spend a little more time on project preparation, which includes looking through all the issues, what might happen, issues of risk that might happen, you don't visualize today, but might happen 10 years later, and you think that through and build that into the concession, then I think you have a mechanism to handle it. But till then, I would say that, you talked about reform. I think the backlog of implementation, the low-hanging fruit is in some 5, 6, 7 lakh crores of those projects. Which have been there, which are hanging in somewhere, they're at some level of progress. I think the biggest thing which probably we ought to be focusing is clear the backlog out.
Edelweiss and CNBC TV 18 present Change India, what India needs.